Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. William Shakespeare is the most quoted writer in the history of the English-speaking world, coming just second only after those who have written down the Bible. But how relevant is he today? Do his plays hold up a mirror to society at the time? And does what he writes about still engage with and reflect the experiences and issues we face today? Do we need to stop talking about Shakespeare? Do we need to stop teaching him at schools? Or are we just missing something huge? I talk about these things and more with Farah Karim-Cooper, whose book, The Great White Bard, Shakespeare, Race and the Future, tells us that we can gain so much from Shakespeare if only we allow ourselves to look at his work differently, and especially through the lens and context of race, racial identity and tensions. Farah Karim-Cooper is Professor of Shakespeare Studies, King's College London, and co-director of Education and Research at Shakespeare's Globe, where she has worked for the last 17 years. She is president of the Shakespeare Association of America after having served 3 years as trustee. She leads the architectural inquiries into early modern theatres at Shakespeare's Globe, overseeing the research into the design and construction of the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, the Globe's indoor Jacobean theatre. She has published over 40 chapters in books, reviews and articles, and is a general editor for Arden's Shakespeare. She has published 3 books, and The Great White Bard, Shakespeare, Race and the Future has been published recently in April 2023 by One Bard Publications. I'm so glad that she's my guest today. Hi Farah, thank you so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me.
So I've been reading your latest book, because I know you've written a number of things, The Great White Bard, Shakespeare, Race and the Future. And it's really, really interesting. So it forces us to look at Shakespeare's work basically through the lens or with race in mind, certainly, giving us like a nuanced perspective of his work and what it can mean to us today and in the future. And as well as being this like very interesting, thoughtful, critical piece of work, it also feels like a bit of a love letter to Shakespeare. I think what really comes out of the pages is just your admiration of him and his work. And that was really nice to read. But I'd really like to know what has drawn you to Shakespeare and his work, and where does that kind of admiration for him come from?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I'm really glad that came across, because that's a really important part of, I suppose, the message behind this book. So I came to Shakespeare originally, like a lot of people do, in school, and I was inspired by the study of Romeo and Juliet. And I think it was because I was a teenager and it was about teenagers, right? So that's usually why it's taught at GCSE level as well. But it wasn't until I was at university where I ended up with this fantastic Shakespeare professor who I knew I wanted to do English literature, but I wasn't sure which direction I wanted to go with it. And she just really inspired me with the way she taught Shakespeare. She did these really close readings of Shakespeare, and she was really kind and she was really glamorous. And I thought, wow, she's, people love her. The students loved her. And it just inspired me. And I thought, well, I'd quite like to do what she does for a living. I'd quite like to teach Shakespeare at a really high level and try to find out everything there is to know about him. So that's kind of how I came to him. And then I just spent years studying him and other writers from his time period. Because if you study him in isolation, you only really learn one thing. Actually reading him in his context and understanding how he came to be and the theater industry of the time that made him, that was all really important as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, because of school and education, our first encounter with Shakespeare does tend to be Romeo and Juliet. And I think depending on how you're taught it, there's levels of like how dark you kind of explore, because it is in the end a story of teenage suicide, isn't it? Like very young suicide, which I feel like is increasingly relevant and important to explore today as mental health crises in the UK especially. I don't know statistics about the US or anywhere around the world, but I know in the UK it's such a massive crisis and a worsening situation that was compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic for sure. But you also say that one of the reasons why you liked Romeo and Juliet was because you felt that it seemed Pakistani, or that it had this like Pakistani essence to it. And I mean, the first time I read that, I burst out laughing, and then because I thought, well, actually, that's true. You have these two families that are rivals, and then you have the young people that decide that they want to get married, and that does sound like very kind of like Pakistani film or Bollywood film. So yeah, I wondered if you had any other experiences like that in engaging as a young person with your own Pakistani heritage and Shakespeare's work.
I think I said that mainly because I was thinking about Juliet and as a young girl, and I was thinking about both my mother and my grandmother, and I wrote a little bit about this, but my grandmother, her father arranged her marriage, and she was very young. She was only 19 when she got married. So she was very, very nervous, very scared, and there was just no way she could choose a different life for herself. You know, there was just no option where in her, this was in pre-partition India. So, so she was, and she talked about it a lot. And obviously my grandfather ended up being the love of her life. And, she just never really recovered from his death, to be honest. But it was, then I thought about my mother, who grew up in a similar environment, but actually her father was quite high up in the railways in India at the time. And so they used to travel a lot. And my mom had a much more, growing up in the 50s, a much more sort of modern upbringing in many ways. But still she was expected to live her life a certain way. But then, of course, she met my father, who was a divorced sea captain with 4 kids, and she fell in love and she wanted to marry him. And her father was like, absolutely not. This is just not going to happen. And she said, I'm doing it anyway. And they didn't speak for like 3 months. And of course, my dad and my grandfather ended up becoming best friends, how these things play out. But it reminded me of a kind of combination of both their stories, and that my mother chose to follow her heart, whereas my grandmother was utterly forced to marry who was chosen for her. And just Juliet's predicament and some of her commentary about it, and the way she talked about what she wanted to pursue, and how her family and her father in particular had tried to contain her desires and contain her agency, that felt very familiar from a cultural perspective.
And I think it's worth to say as well, the story of your mother and your grandmother isn't like an anomaly. I think it exists in different ways and different, to different extents, with so many communities outside of the West or outside of the UK. And I think that's a very familiar experience and a very familiar story that a lot of people will find resonance with. I do want to get into some of what you explore in the book, but before that, I'm really fascinated in the fact that you are basically this like expert on William Shakespeare, but your work primarily is in the field of academia, which we know is very male dominated, but also very white centric. Like a lot of key academics, white men or white women, but even less white women than there are white men. You are a brown woman of Pakistani heritage. What has your experience been like being a woman of color? Have you faced any blocks? Have you had any reservations about how seriously you'd been taken? Yeah, what's it like? Because I feel like it must be very interesting.
Yeah. Now that I'm in a position where I'm a professor and I can look back, it has not been an easy journey. And in fact, I would say I was gatekept out of a lot of institutions. So I had, when I applied to do my master's degree in England, that's when I came over in 1995 from the United States, I found even the program that I was accepted into very, very standoffish. The professors were very standoffish, and I think I might have been seen as the international student, and so I was paying high fees, and they had to teach me. And I wanted to do a PhD, and I asked one of the professors about it, and he actively discouraged me from doing one. He said that I wasn't clever enough, and I wouldn't, get a PhD in this country, and I certainly won't get a teaching post. And he wasn't wrong about that for a long time. And he said I'd never publish anything, which he was wrong about. But it took a lot of courage and strength to kind of try to do it anyway. And so because he didn't show any support or encouragement for my career, I ended up just trying to do it on my own, and I didn't have any mentoring. And so nobody really pushed me towards funding. So I ended up having to be a school teacher in an international school while I was doing my PhD because I had to pay my own way. And so it wasn't an easy journey. I had a great time. I loved teaching that school. That was a fantastic part of my life. But it was hard work. Then when I got my PhD, I found it very difficult to break into the academy. There were a few jobs going, and I just, I was shortlisted for a couple of them. And then I was always pipped out of the job for some reason or another. And then I saw that this job came up at the Globe Theater. And the Globe Theater was not an academic institution. It was a performing arts center. It had a very well-known education department. And the education department had just set up a master's degree in Shakespeare studies with King's College London. And they needed someone to come in and teach it from the Globe side. So I got that job. And actually what was really interesting was it was such a young job, right? There had only been one other person in it other than me, and he only lasted a year or two. And I thought, I could do something with this. I could make this a very academic job because I'd had this little affiliation with King's, so I could teach the MA. So I kind of navigated my career on the outside of academia. And I published, and I was teaching at the Globe and doing some teaching at King's, and I was giving papers at international conferences and meeting people and networking and using the Globe brand to attract and draw scholars to me and give them platforms to have conversations and all sorts of things. And that's how I did it. I had to do it by stealth on the outside. And then eventually in 2020, it was undeniable that I had the credentials, and King's College London gave me an appointment. So I'm a 20% King's and 80% Globe, and they gave me a professorship. And that was based on my publications and my hard work. And I had become president of the Shakespeare Association of America, which is the largest scholarly association in the world associated with Shakespeare. So it wasn't easy. And I have different points in my career where I can see why I was gatekept, why I was kept out, because I was overqualified for jobs, and yet it went to either a white woman or a white man every single time.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like 15 years of incredible amount of hard work and resilience from your point of view. I guess there may have been times where you wanted to give up, but it just sounds like you had to do so much of the work yourself. Whereas like so many people in your position would have had the networks and the guidance and the mentoring to get them through those doors. So that's huge credit to you. And I really hope you're, respected enough in your field now, and your work clearly speaks for itself. So yeah, I'm very excited for you, and I can't wait to see what continues to happen at the Globe and this sort of work that you're doing to bring more people and more people from different communities to theatre. How does generally like the Pakistani community, or if you meet people that are not white, how has the reaction been when you tell them that your work is basically steeped in Shakespeare?
Well, I mean, for the most part, I get a really positive response. And I'm one of these sort of, I'm very, I was steeped in Pakistani culture when I was growing up because of my parents. And also we were kind of part of the Pakistani community in Houston. And, I was part of the student association and all of that. I felt very, but at the same time, I felt very on the outside of that community because I was one of the more American of those of us who had been brought over by our parents in the 1970s. And there were a few of us who were quite Western, and some of our friends were not at all. So I always kind of felt slightly peripheral. So it's interesting that my career ended up becoming that way too, sitting on the edges of different groups all the time. But I think people are generally really positive, and I'm particularly my friends from back home in Houston, who I grew up with and who are Pakistani as well. They're all so proud, and I'm so proud of the work that they've done. You know, I've got a friend who is she went into the arts, but through graphic arts, and she's become a kind of big deal at Apple. And another friend who works for the mayor's office. And, you know, there's lots of really interesting jobs that we've gone into, not your typical, or you go be a doctor or a lawyer. And all of us, when we were kids, were thinking we were going to have to be doctors. But usually I get a really positive response. And I think that because Shakespeare was an export during the British Raj, you know, Shakespeare was instrumental to, you know, sort of creating an education system in India that was British. And so a lot of my family and, you know, everybody grew up reading Shakespeare and knowing Shakespeare and going to see Shakespeare plays. So Shakespeare is a very familiar thing to our community as well.
Absolutely. So in the UK, especially, there's a rising debate about whether or not Shakespeare should be taught in schools, how relevant he is, how relatable, and just how kind of in tune he is with modern day society. And I think this also extends to a lot of the classic writers. There's debates about whether Jane Austen should be taught, whether Louisa May Alcott should be taught. Like there's this debate that is happening. But with Shakespeare in particular, what do you think lies at the heart of that debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think what lies at the heart of that debate, I'll say, is probably white supremacy. And it's because, as I talk about in my book, Shakespeare was constructed as an icon of white excellence and white perfection and white Englishness, as something considered natural, native to Shakespeare because he was English. That's why he's a genius. And that happened in the 18th century. It didn't happen in Shakespeare's own time. In Shakespeare's own time, he was a jobbing playwright. He was scrappy. There were people who were making more money than him, who were more popular than him, writing plays. And he was trying to make his way in the world. And that's the Shakespeare we teach at the Globe. You know, that's the Shakespeare that we understand, because that's the Shakespeare that helped to build the Globe in 1599, right? By the time you get to the 18th century, Shakespeare has been uprooted from that history and is being molded into this, you know, beautiful white statue that you see in Westminster Abbey, right? And literally all of those types of statues are erected post 17th century. And so that Shakespeare we're still very much see a lot, especially in Britain and the US. And so it feels like, oh, Shakespeare's up here. We've got to climb this ladder in order to get to Shakespeare, or I need to understand whiteness in order to get to Shakespeare. When in actuality, if you were just take that away and sort of go back to basics, you have these really, really fascinating, different, challenging, difficult stories, right? Stories about people. And that's why when he did get exported all over the world, and then the British left those countries they had colonized, Shakespeare remained. And then the people there made of Shakespeare whatever they wanted, and nobody was policing them. Whereas here, you get policed if you decide, like the Globe decides to cast Shakespeare in a unique way. They're policed by right-wing newspapers and told that we're ruining Shakespeare or something like that. And that is what makes Shakespeare irrelevant. This idea that Shakespeare is this 18th century towering genius. And that idea of the big white male genius is not really sustainable anymore, because there's too many other identities and personalities and art makers that are also brilliant. And people need to be exposed to a wide range of talents and ideas, and not just one set of ideas. Well, Shakespeare doesn't represent just one set of ideas, but the way he's been created and constructed through that prism, that is the one set of ideas that always gets celebrated. Whereas all the other stuff in Shakespeare is not forgotten about, but is somehow hushed or silenced or quieted. Shakespeare has anti-Semitism in there, but is he an anti-Semite? I don't know. It's really hard to say because his Shylock the Jew is one of the most challenging characters. There are other Jewish characters in early modern plays, and they are much more evil, and and also all the things that are said about Shylock are said about the Christians. So what Shakespeare does is show that anti-Semitism is alive and well in the 16th century. And that is interesting because we're still dealing with anti-Semitism today, right? So anti-Black racism, same thing. There are anti-Black racist comments in some of his comedies. Well, what do we do with that? Do we just ignore it like people have for years and pretended like Shakespeare was too perfect not to have meant that? We need to deal with the imperfections there, and that makes him more human, and that makes him more relevant.
Absolutely. And one of the fascinating things that you write about in the book actually is obviously because Shakespeare existed in the time that he did, we didn't have photographs. And you explain that kind of the portraits of him that have come out have just kind of come out from like various sources and like memories. We have this idea of what he looked like. But also interestingly, you talk about how over time those portraits become more symmetrical. He becomes whiter in the pictures as well, which I found really interesting because it is, and you talk about it as this form of metaphorical whitewashing. And I just, if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, because I don't think it's anything I have ever paid close attention to. But even in the book, you give us a couple of different portraits, and if you look at them, they are marked like significantly different.
Yeah. So in the only one that may have been painted during his lifetime is the Chandos portrait, which is the one with the earring, and that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. And then we have two other images of Shakespeare that come 7 years after he dies. So that is the frontispiece from the first folio, which is the engraving with the big forehead, the one everybody recognizes. And then the other one is the funeral bust that sits over his tomb in the chancel of Trinity Chapel in Stratford upon Avon. So that was also 7 years later, and none of them look like each other, for one thing, right? So it's a little bit bizarre. Trying to find Shakespeare's image is a long life quest, right? In the 18th century, when they were trying to perfect the idea of Shakespeare and the image of Shakespeare, none of these images were satisfying. And so what ended up happening is they decided to start reconstructing Shakespeare's image, and Shakespeare's portrait, not just portraits, but his sculptures, more importantly, were commissioned. And he was the big one in 1741 that was commissioned for Westminster Abbey, and it was put in Poets' Corner. Now, Shakespeare, when he died, was not buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, but a couple of his rival playwrights were, like Ben Jonson. He was buried there, but Shakespeare is not. So that's a really interesting thing as well. So in the 18th century, they were like, well, Shakespeare belongs in Westminster Abbey. That's the national cathedral. So they erected a statue to him there. And it's a neoclassical statue. And neoclassical sculpture was very, very popular in the 18th century. And it was called neoclassical because it was meant to echo ancient classical statues, which people assumed were all painted white, but they were not. In the original ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they painted lots of colors all over their statuary. But it's just over those 1,000 years, what happened is the paint faded. But in the 18th century, there was an art historian from Germany who just absolutely loved and fell in love with these images and defined perfection based on this white sort of chiseled sculpture, right? The perfect chiseled face, which also had echoes in racial science that was developing at the time. Which is a fake science, but it's an anthropology of race, right? Where people were collecting skulls of ancestors, and then discovering that, oh, this skull looks like it has a bigger brain, or et cetera, et cetera. I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know the technical language, but essentially they created a racial classification system, and the Caucasian skull was seen as the most perfect one. So you get this sort of racial anthropology happening at the same time as neoclassical art history is deciding what is perfection. And that then influences the way in which Shakespeare's face is eventually recrafted. And I'm not saying they were saying, oh, this is a direct response. It all is something that flooded into the culture and the intellectual discourse of the time. So this is why it ends up that way. And that's the association that I make between those two fields.
Yeah, just this sort of, how can we show in every way possible that Shakespeare was this perfect Englishman representation of society, or like what we should aim to be, I guess. Yeah. And obviously, like, those ideas of perfection, unfortunately, we still see those today. Yeah. That's that science that you talked about in terms of the social anthropology side of proving racial science. We've seen it in history as well. We've seen it with accounts of the growth of Nazism and the arguments that were used that Aryan race is superior. That was based on some kind of, racial ideas, but really sad, unfortunately. And I think one of the things you mentioned earlier as well was that the different elements of Shakespeare's plays are somewhat washed over. And so many people will say that Shakespeare's plays are not representative of society. And then there's a counter argument that's like, well, that's okay, because, at that time, there weren't people of colour in the UK and there weren't Black people in the UK. So, of course, majority of his characters are going to be white. But actually, you remind us that this is just the kind of misconception of history. And what we are seeing recently, in recent years especially, is a retelling of history, which actually says that, the most common narrative is that there was migration in the 1940s, and then we had the Windrush generation, and people came for purposes of employment, and that's how mass immigration happened, and that's when the UK was diversified. But actually what's coming up now is a more nuanced understanding that there was always different communities in the UK. There were always Black and brown people in the UK. There was always international trade and communication and respect, but also curiosity and a level of skepticism that was also always there. That I think they are two tongues that are going to always go hand in hand. And so actually you bring to light some of the characters in Shakespeare's play that actually are Black or are brown, and that kind of makes us, and what you say with that is that actually Shakespeare was engaging with the fact that society was not just fully white. And you say that as well, that like there hasn't been enough research into that, and that's one of the things that I think you are hoping to look into, is exactly who did Shakespeare interact with and what his experiences were. But I spoke a lot just there, but I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think we all kind of, grew up thinking that the Elizabethan period was, everybody was white, essentially. And if you watch period dramas like Shakespeare in Love, or the movie Elizabeth, or whichever, movies that are set in that time period, you always get this very, very white world, and you don't see anything beyond that. And so that's just lies. And it's very, very dangerous, because actually when you start casting things in ways that are more progressive, then it makes people angry, and then people start getting death threats. It's insane. So actually, how about if we just reckon with the past and tell the truth and tell history exactly as it happened in terms of what we know, we might have a better chance of making progress. So in 2008, there was this fantastic book that was published by Imtiaz Habib, basically trawled the archives and parish registers and discovered the presence of Black Africans throughout the Tudor period. So even starting in Henry VIII's and a little bit earlier, his time, and tries to establish that Some of these many of these people were living free. They were not slaves because slavery was illegal within England, not outside of England, but within England. And many of them were servants. There were people who came over from Europe, like potentially somebody who came from Antwerp, named Reasonable Blackmore, who lived in Southwark, and he was a silk weaver. And potentially had something to do with the theater industry, as some other scholars have since discovered. And so this just opens up possibilities, right? It opens up possibilities. We also learn from the records that there were interracial relationships, that mixed race children were being born in 16th century England. So this is something we've never talked about. Meanwhile, Shakespeare's had this play, Titus Andronicus, published in 1623, with a mixed race child in it, but nobody's ever acted as if that's anything but fantasy. So this research has been really valuable because not only has it told us something different about the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, but it's also told us that actually we can start thinking about Shakespeare differently, because who's to say that Black people did not go to Shakespeare's theater and watch the plays? No, there's no evidence that says they didn't, right? So, and some people would say, oh, but there's no evidence to say they did. Well, the evidence for who was in the theaters as audience at the time is so fragmented. It's really hard to work out exactly who was in the theater. So we have some evidence, but we don't have all of it. So this is a really exciting development. And I think it opens up Shakespeare in thousands of ways. And so thinking not just about the racial identities that he brings out on stage, but also the language of race. And isn't it interesting that there's anti-Black racism? But what if there was also Black people in the audience at the same time? This is a really interesting, charged kind of historical moment potentially. So yeah, I think it's really exciting. And since then, people like Miranda Kaufman have written books like Black Tutors, which was a real hit and really kind of made the general public aware of these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. You do write quite a bit about the interracial coupling in Shakespeare's work, and you relate it to like how we can also understand, or how we can look at the situation with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, which is obviously like a very recent example. But I guess just the fact that similarities are there in Shakespeare was writing hundreds and hundreds of years ago is really interesting. Do you think that, obviously I think it's interesting now to look at Shakespeare's plays and see things like interracial coupling, and there's also self-love, Black self-love in at least one of Shakespeare's plays. And you write in the book, you link that to bell hooks's political resistance through self-love, which I loved reading about that because I also love bell hooks. But really, really interesting, because that character does talk about the color of his skin and how he thinks that it's better because he thinks it's beautiful, and that was really good. Do you think that at the time that would have impacted white people in the audience, or do you think that it was something that they considered to be part of fiction?
I think it's really hard. It's really, really hard to say what Elizabethan audiences were thinking, because even with all the study that we've done about culture at the time, there's always so much nuance. I mean, imagine if someone 400 years ago tried to study our time period. And then someone asks, well, what do you think people thought about Donald Trump? You can't say one answer to that, right? Because it's so nuanced, and so culture is so pluralistic, right? So it's hard to say. I think it's really interesting that there was a lot of interracial relationships at the time, which meant that there was a level of not just tolerance, but acceptance of people from different parts of the world. But there was also in the literature of the time and in some of the political writing of the time, a lot of racism and a lot of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. It's hard to say that Shakespeare's audience might have thought, wow, Aaron is a really interesting character. I think they would have found him absolutely terrifying. And I think they would have found him absolutely fascinating and attractive in that sense. Like they would have been attracted to his personality, which was really, really dynamic. I feel like he's almost a precursor for Iago in Othello, and he has this kind of ability to kind of really seduce the audience and make them feel caught up in his drama, and a bit like Richard III as well. That's the character he reminds me the most of. He's really vulnerable, but at the same time, he's angry. He's full of anger. But yes, the idea of the self love, I think, would have been very revolutionary in Shakespeare's time. There are lots of other Black characters across other plays of the time, not written by Shakespeare, and you don't see the same level of kind of self awareness. Even in The Merchant of Venice, the Prince of Morocco comes in to choose a casket, and he says, "Mislike me not for my complexion." And he says, the women of my culture, they love this, and he says, and this has also frightened my enemies. So it's useful to him and it's attractive. And so you get a sense that there may have been people who felt that and understood that, and then people who would have been horrified by it.
Absolutely. As always, right? There's always going to be people that are horrified by things like that and people that love it. But that's really interesting. One of the other things you write quite early on in the book is about whether or not we should expect to feel uncomfortable when we watch Shakespeare's plays and come to his work. I guess that's one of the reasons why so many people are resistant to exploring things that are ugly or racist or misogynistic, because they don't want to feel those feelings of discomfort with somebody that is so respected and just considered amazing. But you actually interestingly talk about the physical layout of theatres at the time, and I think the Globers also mirrors that, and I think this is my mistake in that I've never been to the Globe, so I don't know. But to me, going to the theatre is a very lavish activity. The seats are always plush and very nice, and you wear a nice outfit. It's not the kind of thing that you wear jeans and trainers to. And well, maybe a little bit more so now, but typically the theatre is very fancy. But you describe actually the seats being really hard, and they don't even have a proper back, so you're tired when you're sat down. And I think there's lots of standing seats anyway. And also there's some of the scenes have been so gruesome that people have fainted and have to have left. And I liked that sort of connection between the physical discomfort of sitting and watching a play and being confronted by some really harsh questions and having a mirror held up to society and to ourselves as well. And I just wondered if you could share your thoughts on that, because you write it so beautifully in the book as well.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there is this really interesting, when I had been working on Shakespeare and Race as a public program at the Globe since about 2018. And what I was finding is that people were made uncomfortable by it, and they didn't want to engage with it, right? Certain people. And then I started getting attacked for it by the right-wing press and various others. And I thought, what is this? Why are people so uncomfortable about this? Oh, because Shakespeare is meant to be comfortable, right? So when you think about the Shakespeare that gets sold in souvenir shops, is you can buy, even in our shop, you can buy Shakespeare's flowers and you can plant them, all the flowers that he names, and, Shakespeare and love. And you get these beautiful tea towels with hearts on them and Romeo plus Juliet, And so Shakespeare is this very endearing, soft, enjoyable, comforting, companion almost to our lives. And he is all of those things. Yes. I mean, there is beauty and love and incredible poetry there. But there's also death and cannibalism and rape and murder and horrible things, right? Dismemberment. So what do we do with that? Are we supposed to continue to feel like we just don't engage with the violence of Shakespeare? And so what I was just trying to do was to suggest that Shakespeare's sort of strategy is to make you feel all of those things. And one of the most exciting things, I think, for him might have been to see you feel all of those things, or, contradictory emotions in 1 hour, right? So I'm going to make you feel like this. And in the next scene, you're going to feel like that. And he gives you all of these little props to hold on to as you're experiencing extreme tragedy. So an example might be when in Titus Andronicus, Lavinia comes out and she's had her hands chopped off and her tongue cut out. So she's bleeding. And it's a horrible sight. And it is why our audiences fainted when they saw her. And to think what had happened to her, as well as the sight of this post-violent attack. Well, Shakespeare's the character of Marcus, who is her uncle, sees her, and he describes what he sees, but he completely colors it with this beautiful poetry. He calls her hands these beautiful tree limbs that get lopped off, and she used to play the lute with those hands, and that river of blood. The way he describes it is poetic and beautiful and sublime. So Shakespeare gives you these two images at the same time, this gorgeous poetry with this horrible vision. And that's his way of helping you to cope with the most difficult thing you'll see in the show, right? And I find it really interesting. It was part of his strategy. And so the reason I use the theater as an example is because, this idea of a comfortable plush theater is late 18th century, 19th century theater, right? Where, you can start, especially when electricity comes in, you can turn the lights down and everybody can just sit in the dark. Well, in Shakespeare's theater, that wasn't the case. 700 or more people would be standing. And the energy that produces in the space, as well as in your bodies, is attentive. It's jittery. It's engaged, right? So you can't get bored. And so instead of just attending the theater and kicking back and letting it wash over you, you are attending to it. And you might have to shift legs, or you decide you're going to move over here because you like that character. So you're going to follow him across the stage. Or, if you're sitting, you're kind of fidgeting or talking to your friends or eating your hazelnuts or, drinking your lager or whatever it is that they gave them in that time period. So it is not, it's like being at a football match more so today, or a basketball game, rather than going to the theater, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, really fascinating. Yeah, really fascinating. Because I guess as well, like, entertainment would have been so different. I mean, on TV, so much of it is like horseback racing, but it's like fighting. It's, that a lot of even entertainment was very gruesome. And Shakespeare doesn't tend to give us very many happy endings in his plays either, which I remember as when I was younger and reading it, I always felt like, but where's the happy ending? Like, I can't actually think of a play that has a happy ending. It's either really sad or it's very gruesome and bloody. There's a war usually, or a battle. And I guess that's also a reminder that he was trying to keep it real, I guess, in the sense that life, there isn't always a happy ending. Often there's not, right? And also that the play is not the be all and end all, because life will continue for our characters beyond that as well, which I think is really nice. Yeah. You write in the book as well a lot about, casting and actual plays that take place. You do write about it in the book. I want to know what your opinion is of race-blind casting, especially for Shakespeare, when there are so few Black characters or people of color in the plays. Personally, I'm not sure where I stand on it. Like, I think it's important, because if we are putting on plays where there are 95% of characters are white, and if we don't do race-blind casting, does that mean we only give opportunities to white actors to play those roles? But yeah, I'm still not fully sure on how I feel or what I think about it. But what do you think?
Well, it's a big hot potato. It's very complicated, and it's a very controversial topic as well, because a lot of people get very upset about casting decisions. But I think the main thing is, I generally do not believe, as a philosophy towards society or casting, in race neutrality. I think that race neutrality is dangerous, because it makes certain assumptions about people's identities, and therefore about their experiences, which, race neutrality has led us to major inequities in terms of social and educational and healthcare. And this is something that we're still trying to get our minds around, but it is due to race neutrality, because everybody is seen as equal now, right? So if we're all equal, we're all the same, then we should all have the same shot at life. And that's just not a reality. It's just not. The white middle class Western Europeans have had several hundred years of a head start. Put it that way. So that's like the big chunky issue that sits behind ideas around casting. And so colorblind casting is something that I suppose was necessary in the early 20th century in order to integrate Black actors into mainstream Shakespearean theater. And so that was just kind of the thing that happened. And it was a really good thing that happened. But over time, what has happened is the theater industry in Britain and the UK, in the US, is very, very white, right? It's run by white people. It has been for many, many years. So the whole industry has been set up by white people for white people. And so when you have Black and Asian actors coming in and wanting to work in those spaces, there are a lot of inequities built into the system of making a play. So whether that's from the auditioning experience to casting to costume fitting to lighting, right? You think about lighting Black actors and the kind of how people just didn't think about it for years, to costume design, set design, and also language, and like how, if you're a Black actor and you're asked to play a character that speaks anti-Black language, what do you do with that? Yeah. Right. So what I advocate for is thinking about creating a structure around an acting company that is anti-racist, that has thought about what the experience is for everybody that's involved. And anti-racism is also encompassing of being equitable towards actors who are represent disabilities and actors who are trans and various other kinds of identities that have a huge amount of inequity. So an anti-racist structure will hopefully support, will create an inclusive structure around acting, an acting company. And then within that, if you've got all your actors sort of taken care of and they feel like they've got a voice and they feel like they're having a sense of belonging within the theater company and in the theater house, when you get into the rehearsal room, how the director decides they want to deal with the language of the play in relation to the bodies that are going to be performing it is a conversation that needs to be had so that actors feel like they have agency in making that decision. There are Black actors who say, I don't want to play myself, I want to play Hamlet. And so race for them is just not an issue. They just don't want to think about it and they don't care about it. It's not that they don't care about race, but it's not an issue for them in the moment. Okay. But then you have other Black actors who say, I don't want to play a white person again. So if you're hiring me as a Black actor, what do you want me here for? Right. So sometimes a Shakespeare play will be cast and they might decide that Polonius in Hamlet is going to be a Black man. And that wouldn't necessarily be weird because Africans were living across Europe since the Middle Ages. So maybe Polonius is a Black man. So if Polonius is a Black man, his kids need to have there needs to be some racial logic there. So Ophelia and Laertes, what is their identity? Maybe they're mixed race because Polonius's wife is dead. So we don't know. Maybe she was white. So actors and directors need to think about these things when they're casting. If there is a character that receives a lot of anti-Black language, how are they cast, right? So who's going to be the person in that role and who's going to take care of them if they are a Black actor and decide they can handle that? So it's a really, really important conversation. It's complex. You can't just say I'm anti-colorblind casting or I'm pro-colorblind casting, because for me, it's about making sure that the actor has agency and the actor feels seen and heard, and that the actor feels as though they belong in a company. If you've got those things, then what you decide to do together as a company is your choice.
Absolutely. And I think that that can mean that like certain lines are omitted or things are changed in order to make everyone feel comfortable. But if you decide that you could change that a character is going to be a black man or woman or a brown man or woman, obviously then it does need to make sense, like racially, in terms of their children and so forth. But also, could that not possibly have longer lasting impacts on the play? Because if in the original play, if it's ambiguous, we're not sure, or maybe we know that it's a white person, or it could be anything. But if you do change them to be a brown person or a black person, would that also not impact that character's trajectory, or the clothes they wear, or the food they eat, or the language they speak, for example? Would that also not have to change?
That's a good question. And I think it depends where, because a lot of productions nowadays are set in modern times or set in different time periods where there was a lot more visible diversity. And so you don't necessarily need to make those choices, or you could just have that as part of your stage business, right? So it doesn't matter if you say, you could set the Taming of the Shrew in Pakistan. And if you do that, then everybody's wearing Pakistani clothes, right?
Yeah.
And if it's set in that country in 1975 or 1985, then it doesn't matter. You can have them sitting there, eating roti or whatever whatever you want them to do. Though that's stage business. It's not written into the play by Shakespeare anyway, right? Shakespeare doesn't. Sometimes he does name costumes or clothes. He'll talk about people's doublets and hose or gowns and bodice and things like that. But modern productions have long taken that language out anyway. If they don't want to have a doublet in, or they might just have a denim jacket and he calls it a doublet. I think audiences can be expected to suspend their disbelief around those little things.
And just quickly, obviously you do talk about it in the book, but I've also seen you talk about it in various interviews as well. You were a little bit nervous when this book came out, and one of the things that you feared was that this argument would rear its ugly head about race itself and time. And does race as a concept, what it means today, did it mean the same thing in Shakespeare's time? And therefore, can we even apply what we understand to be race today to Shakespeare's work? Which I find, and I know it has been debunked by some academics, but I think it still pops up. I find it an argument that doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't make it valid even if our concepts of race have changed over time. But yeah, I wondered if you could just touch on that slightly as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think the definition of race that Shakespeare and his world were operating under is much more expansive than history's allowed it to be. Race just means lineage in that time period. It doesn't. It means lineage. It also means kinship. It means blood. It means religion. It means geography, which is why Muslims and Jews were seen as having a different race, right? So that is a really important distinction. And that language of race is still with us. At the same time, from the Middle Ages on, color coding was happening with Black and white. So white was given positive value time and time again, and Black was given negative value time and time again through medieval iconography, even of the devil. The devil in these paintings of frescoes across Europe, the devil is often painted black. And in poetry of the time, and Dante and various others, the devil is referred to as black, and blackness is linked to witchcraft, the diabolic, demons, etc. And so around this time, we also know Black Africans were in people's imaginations because of the intercultural conversations that were happening. And so you kind of think this type of color coding that happened created a kind of racial thinking that also was inclusive of skin color and phenotype. And as people were traveling around the world and commenting on the people that they were discovering and meeting, this language of phenotype comes up again and again and again. And it is couched in a context where difference is being established. They are different from us. And so this language escalates over time. In the 18th century, obviously the slave trade was peaking with Britain, right? Britain was very, very engaged and a major actor of the slave trade during that period. They formed the Royal African Company in the late 17th century. So they must have had some idea about what they mean by race by then.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it didn't just come up. It didn't just happen overnight. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you have written a lot of academic pieces of work, books and journals and articles, etc. But this book that you've written is not for the academic. It's kind of like a popular nonfiction. I don't know if that's the right title. But and it is, I think, definitely very accessible. So if you're not somebody that is an academic or has read a huge amount of Shakespeare, I think it's still very easy to read. But what was that like for you to kind of have to put on a hat that isn't steeped in academic text or academia itself?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of tough. My editor was brilliant at sort of, knocking all of that stuff out of me. She'd send me back drafts, but also because I've worked at the Globe for so long, I've written a lot of program essays for the programs people get. And so I've been writing for the general public for quite some time. So I've always known the kind of language. And it's a real balance because you're not dumbing anything down, because if you do, that suggests that you think the general public are stupid, which they are absolutely not. But the academic language, academic books are steeped in a lot of theory and methodology, and there's a lot of jargon and technical vocabulary that comes with those theories and methodologies. And so you simply just have to kind of use the methodologies without constantly naming and signposting it, so that all you get is a kind of crisp analysis. And actually, more and more academics are writing with that more crisp way of speaking. A lot of the PhD students coming up now are writing much more accessible prose because, they're writing and they want to put this stuff out on the internet, and they want to write blogs as well. So, and they want their books to sell, So I think academic publishing is going to shift over the next, 15 years or so. So it wasn't as hard. I think what was difficult was, the topic of Shakespeare and race has a critical legacy. So people have been writing about this, mainly scholars of color, since the 80s. And this work has been marginalized. The scholars working in this area have been marginalized in the field. And my biggest anxiety was to do justice to that work, because this is a discussion that stayed in the academy, which is why the general public were like, what does Shakespeare have to do with race? Nobody ever wrote to the general public about this topic. We only talked to each other about it, So I really wanted to give an airing to this topic so that it felt more mainstream. And then people just kind of went, oh yeah, race. Yes, obviously, and that would make the lives of my colleagues in the field easier as they navigate their universities or their audiences or their institutions. So my anxiety was doing justice to a topic that has a critical legacy.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think I have seen it definitely as well, in that more academic people of academic backgrounds are trying to make sure that their writing is more accessible, because they have important things to say, and there's no point in writing an essay or a book if it's just going to sit on a shelf and be read by people who also probably agree with you anyway and have been part of your research. Like, we don't need to exist in these echo chambers anymore. We need to get the voice out there. And just to end, how do you think really or what do you think really about the engagement of Shakespeare in the future? Where do you think we go from here?
Well, I mean, hopefully the idea of reading Shakespeare honestly is something that we can take with us, of not worshiping him overly, so that if someone says something that challenges your perspective, that you get angry at that person or want to lash out at them. Why can't we allow for the plurality of responses to Shakespeare? That's what I really want. I want people to be able to take a Shakespeare play and put it on in any way, shape, or form that they want and cast it however they want, because the plays are so robust, they can handle it. Why should it offend some person over there? So I think it's the plurality, accessibility, contemporary relevance, that Shakespeare tells stories that we understand even now. And it's not to say it's universal, because I don't like that word. It kind of feels very like white and male. It's actually more so about identification. I can identify, as I said in my book, I'm a brown woman, and I feel seen and heard in his plays. Sometimes I feel seen in ways that offend me, and I want to talk to Shakespeare about that. Or I want to talk to my teachers about that, or my students about that. So I think that keeping Shakespeare a dialogue with him, where you challenge him and he challenges you, that's the best relationship to have with a writer, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is really important, as you said, to maybe take Shakespeare off the pedestal that we've put him on. That doesn't mean that we don't respect him and admire his work, but also to remember that, well, nobody is perfect. And that by pointing out inconsistencies or flaws or things that are problematic, we're not cancelling him, right? There's this huge cancel culture at the moment. Like, we're not cancelling him. In order to fully love and appreciate something, you need to also be aware of its flaws, and you need to also almost like help overcome those. And I guess that's some of the work that you do at the Globe, in terms of how do we now bring these plays onto stages and ensure that our actors are, diverse, but also appreciated and safe and comfortable. So well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really fascinating and really interesting. I have loved speaking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Farah for such an insightful, interesting, and really thoughtful conversation. It's really helped me change the way I think about William Shakespeare. I loved every second of this conversation, and I hope that you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.